In this video, we're going to see how we can warp between different positions in our level with some screen fade effects. So why don't we go ahead and see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to hit Control and P and start the game. So we now have a nice fade in effect to start the level. And you can see I have 4 different warp pipes, warp pipe A and warp pipe B on the right and left. If I jump up on warp pipe A and press the C button, I get a nice fade in and fade out, and I'm teleported to the second warp pipe A. If I come to warp pipe B, fade in, fade out, and I'm transported to the first warp pipe B. And they're two-way streets, so I can go from second warp pipe to first warp pipe on either one. Alright, so let's see how we can do this. So I have a blank scene here that we'll get started in. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a warp pipe prefab here. So why don't we go ahead and make a 3D object cylinder, and I'm going to reset its positions in my inspector on the right. Alright, why don't we make it a little bit thicker. I'm going to turn off or get rid of the capsule collider by removing the component, and I'm going to add a mesh collider just so we have something to stand on a little bit easier than a round capsule collider. Then I'm going to go ahead and give it a pipe material, and I'm going to bring it up where it's still kind of clipping through the ground. So I have my warp pipe mesh, and I'm going to name it warp pipe mesh. But I'm not done with my warp pipe. I'm going to create an empty game object, and I'm going to totally reset its positions. And I'm going to call this my warp pipe. And I'm going to parent my warp pipe mesh underneath my warp pipe. This empty parent game object I just created called warp pipe is going to serve 2 purposes. It's going to be able to trigger my collision detection from whenever I activate my warp. It's also going to explain the position of my warp pipe mesh. But we'll notice something. My translation arrows, my position arrows, are in the side of my warp pipe. So that's no good because it'll spawn my player into my warp pipe. So let's unparent that warp pipe mesh. And I want to go to my warp pipe empty game object that's zeroed out. And I'm going to bring it up to be about right here. Right now I'm trying to position these arrows in a position in which my player character controller will be spawned at. But right now I don't really have a reference because I don't have a player controller in my screen. Well, why don't I go ahead and import my standard assets characters. So I'll do that. I've already imported them, so they're sitting right here. I'm going to go to my first person character controller. I'm just going to drag and drop my FPS controller in. It's already got the tag player, and it's all good. So I'm going to reset its position. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to position my first person controller at about the same height, about the height I would expect to spawn on top of these warp pipes. So like so. Next, I'm going to take my warp pipe empty game object, and I'm going to try to match these position or movement handles about the same height. And I'm switching between the two. And right now I'm just creating a loose reference for where I need to position my warp pipe so my player will spawn at a nice height above my warp pipe mesh object. So that looks pretty good. So I'm going to reset my player, and I'm just going to pull him back here, and I'm going to increase his height to be about 0.9. So he's standing on top of the ground, and I'm going to leave my first person controller alone for now. Alright, so I have my warp pipe mesh and my warp pipe heights all set up pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add a component on my empty warp pipe game object. I'm going to make a box collider. Now this collider right here is going to be a trigger, so click trigger to yes in your inspector over here. And then I'm just going to position a little cage for this box collider to detect the presence of my first person controller. So just position it enough to where the pipe will be able to tell whether or not my player, and if you lose it, you can go ahead and re-click it. Press our little joint tool right there to get our controls back. And that looks pretty good. This little box here will decide whether or not my player is in position on top of my warp pipe. So now I'm finally going to parent my warp pipe mesh, And now I have a nice little warp pipe set up. I have a nice player character position right here, and a nice big collider so I can detect the presence of my player on top of my warp pipe. All right, I'm gonna keep my height values the way they are, and I'm gonna go ahead and make this a prefab. So I'm going to go to my project folder. I have a prefabs folder already made. I'm going to drag and drop warp pipe into my prefabs. But I'm not done with warp pipe yet. I need to give it a script. So I'm going to go to my scripts folder right here. And you can see we're going to be making a game manager script and a warp pipe script. For right now, I'm going to delete these because we're going to make them from scratch. So I'm going to right click in this empty space, and I'm going to create a C# script, and I'm going to make that warp pipe script again. All right. And then I'm going to drag and drop my warp pipe script on top of my parent warp pipe object. And now I have a warp pipe script attached. If I double click on my warp pipe script, I'll bring up monodevelop, and we can get rocking with some code. So I'm going to position my monodevelop just the way I like it, in between my hierarchy and my inspector. All right, so we're going to do a few things in this warp pipe script. It's going to be a pretty small script overall. So I'm going to actually just delete my void start and void update. I won't need those. But I am going to make a public int called warp pipe number. This is going to be a classification we use to basically give our warp pipes numbers so we can tell our different warp pipes apart from one another. And then I'm going to say void on trigger stay. I'm not going to use a collider other. We're only going to detect whether our player is on top of our pipe. And we're going to say if input.get key down key code, and then I'm going to say C for like if we crouched inside of a Mario game, then we'll go down the warp pipe. So C for crouch. Basically, we're checking to see if the user presses C on the keyboard, and then we're going to say warp my player. So we're just going to comment that out because that's what we want our if statement to do right here. So I'm going to hit Control S and save. What I need to do now is make a game manager so I can actually warp my player. My game manager is going to have a function that actually warps my player. This script right here only checks to see if we're on top of my warp pipe and if I've pressed the C key. So I'm going to hit Control S and save that script. So I'm going to go back to my scripts folder, and I'm going to make a new script. I'm going to call this game manager, like so. And then I need a empty game object in my scene to place that script on. So I'll make an empty game object, reset its values, and we're going to call this game manager. And I like to put my game manager at the very top of my hierarchy. And then we're just going to drag and drop my game manager script onto my game manager object so my script has a presence in my scene. So we can see my game manager script over here in my inspector on the right. All right, so I'm going to double click my game manager. My game manager is going to be a singleton object here, meaning that I'll be able to access all the functions in the script from any class available in my scene or in my game project. So how do we set up a singleton object? We're going to go through it real quick. The magic behind the singleton object that allows us to access this game manager globally is by making it a public static. And then we're going to call game manager. We're referencing the exact same script we're making. We're going to call this variable name instance. And we're going to set it to null for nothing. So right now we basically just declared an instance variable of type game manager, which actually points back at our script. All right, so in my void start, I'm going to actually change this to void awake. And I'm going to do a few things here. I got to have some conditional checks to set up the singleton logic. So I'm going to say if instance, which is the variable name that we'll use to access our game manager script. If instance equals null, that means if instance has not been initialized yet, then we're going to initialize it. We're going to say instance equals this, which means this script, this game object. Else if instance doesn't equal null, meaning if instance already has something is already been initialized, meaning we might have two game objects in our scene, Then we're going to destroy the possible duplicate game object in our scene. Yeah, that's right. All right, great. So this logic right here basically allows us to have only one game object rocking in our scene, and it makes a instance of itself so we can access it within any script going on right now. All right, great. So now with a game object script and game object game manager object in my scene, I can now start making some functions and different things that allow me to really get my warp pipe to warp my player. All right, what's the next step? Well, why don't we go back to our scene and set up a little test scene that we can use to test all of my warping. So I'm going to make my scene size a little bit bigger. And I have some 3D text that I have hidden. And then I'm going to duplicate this warp pipe 4 times, or 3 more times rather. And I'm going to position it under this text right here. And I'm going to name them to be the correct name. So I'm going to pause while I make and position these warp pipes, and I'll be right back. So I've got my warp pipes made and positioned, and notice I've named them inside of my hierarchy, 1A, 2A, 1B, and 2B. I need to do a few more things in my hierarchy and inspector. First, I'm going to get my first-person controller out of the way. I'm going to kind of nestle it up here. And I'm going to delete the extra camera I had in my scene. Next, I need to go to my 2A warp pipes right here. And I need to assign them the same warp pipe number in my warp pipe script. This number right here is going to say these 2 warp pipes transition between each other. So warp pipe 1 and warp pipe 1A and 2A are going to be both named or have the number of 1. Meanwhile, warp pipe B will have the number of 2. So my B warp pipes are called warp pipe number 2, and my 2A warp pipes over here in my hierarchy have the same number of 1. So that's going to be very important whenever we're trying to warp between our certain game objects or our exact warp pipes in our scene. That warp pipe number is basically going to tell our warp function which pipe we're going to go in between. All right, so I got my scene set up. Next, I'm going to go ahead and bring back MonDevelop and go to my game manager. Whenever I awake, I need to do a few more things. I need to have access to my first-person controller so I can actually move the position of my first-person controller. And I also need to have access to every single pipe in my scene so I know which ones I want to transition in between. So to do that, we're going to make 2 variables. We're going to call them not game manager. We're going to say game object player, and then we're going to say game object, and then we're going to use brackets to say that this is going to be an array of game objects. I'm going to say warp pipe array. And you know what? I think I'm going to make these public so we can see them at work inside of our inspector. Like so. I'll hit Control S to save. Alright. It was giving me a little compile error because I had just else right here. This needed to be else if I was giving it a conditional statement to me. So I corrected that so we shouldn't have any more errors over here. Well, let me save it. Alright. So now my game manager has been updated with some new public variables here. I have a game object player that's empty, and I have a warp pipe array of size 0. Neither of these game objects are populated yet. So after we, in our void awake, why don't we go ahead and populate these 2 game objects? So we're going to do that by using tags. My first-person controller already has the tag of player, so that'll be pretty easy. We'll say if player equals null, meaning if the player game object variable is empty, we're going to say player equals game object. I keep saying game manager. Game object dot find game object with tag singular. You notice there was game objects and game object. We want a singular game object with tag, and we want to say we're looking for the tag player. All right. Next, we want to do the same kind of logic. We're going to say if warp pipe array dot length, meaning there's nothing populating my warp pipe array, and the length is 0. So if my warp pipe array has nothing in it and its length is 0, I'm going to say warp pipe array dot or equals game object dot find game objects. This time I'm going to use the plural version, and we're going to look for the tag warp pipe. But we haven't really set up a tag of warp pipe, so why don't we go ahead and do that? I'm going to select my very first warp pipe and see how it's untagged. We're going to add a tag, and we're going to call this warp pipe. All right, I'm going to reselect my warp pipe, and I'm going to assign it warp pipe tag, and we're going to hit apply. And that will update my warp pipe prefab across all the warp pipes in my scene. Remember, because we made our warp pipe a prefab, so any changes we make to one and then hit apply, it'll propagate to all the warp pipes in our scene. All right, great. Looks like I had some extra scripts. Let me remove some of these. I don't know how that happened. All right. So making sure we just have one warp pipe script on all of our game objects. That'll be good. All right. So we got a warp pipe tag set up on all my warp pipes in my scene. We're ready to rock and roll. Now, if my game pipe or my warp pipe array is 0, as soon as the game starts and the void awake function, we're going to populate my array with all the warp pipes in my scene. So I'm going to hit Control S, and why don't we see that happen? I'm going to select my game manager, and you'll see my player and my warp pipe array become populated. Well, that is if maximize play wasn't turned on. So I'll hit play. You can see that my FPS controller is now in my player game object, and I have every single warp pipe in my scene inside of my array now. That's going to be very important for picking out which warp pipe we want to warp to. And notice how they're not in order. Well, never fear, that won't be a problem for the for loop we're about to set up. All right, so everything's going good so far. We have a game manager that can find my player and find all of my pipes in my array. Why don't we go ahead and get rid of this void update? We're not going to use void update in this instance, but we are going to make a public void warp function. All right. So what is this going to do? Well, it's going to warp my player. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my brackets. That's some weird spacing I did. Set up my brackets so my syntax will be spot on. So public void warp, and then we're going to have logic that warps player. I'm going to hit Control S. So now that I have my function made, I'm going to go to my warp pipe script, and we're going to say, we're going to call that function inside my game manager now. We're going to do this by saying game manager instance warp. We're going to call the warp function. And what we actually want to do now is we want to pass what warp pipe number our current pipe is. So we're going to do parentheses, and we're going to pass warp pipe number. And we also want to pass what game object we're currently standing on top of, what game object we're currently interacting with. So we're just going to say game object. We want lowercase g. All right, great. Let me spell that correctly. So whenever we call our warp function, we're going to be giving it our warp pipe number, and we're going to pass along what object our current script we're working on, what object that is. So if we're standing on warp pipe 1A, we're going to pass its warp pipe number, and we're going to pass the whole object itself. All right. But we're getting an error in our console. No overload method, warp takes 2 arguments. That's because we haven't specified that we're passing in our warp pipe number and our current game object that we're trying to warp from. So we got to go ahead and set up some variables inside of our function here. We do that by saying int passed warp pipe number, and then game object let's see. Yeah. Game object past warp pipe object. So now that'll please Unity. No more error messages. So we're going to use these two local function variables that we are just declared right here inside of our logic right here. So for loops and arrays. How are these going to work together? Well, let's go ahead and set up a for loop. So for int I, here's our counter variable, equals 0. And then we say, as long as our counter variable is less than our warp pipe array.length, then we're going to keep looping through our for loop. And then every time we loop through it, we're going to add 1 to our counter. Let's make our brackets like so. So we're going to go through our warp pipe array, which when I press play, it's populated. This for loop is going to go through every single warp pipe here. And I want you to pay attention to the name element 0, 1, 2, and 3. Basically, that is the position of each warp pipe in our array. Position 0, position 1, position 2, and position 3. So for loops are really nice because this counter variable acts as a way to point at every single one of these element 0, 1, 2, 3, every single one of these positions. I say that loosely. So we'll be able to point at each one of these warp pipes by using our counter variable that will correspond to what element position each warp pipe is in. So we're going to go through all of our pipes in our array. So we're going to say if warp pipe, warp pipe array counter variable I, meaning whichever element we're currently looking at in our for loop in our array, dot get component. Now we need to be able to get at the warp pipe script on every single one of these warp pipes in our array because we need to be able to look at the warp pipe number. And if that warp pipe number equals the past warp pipe number, then that's the warp pipe we want to look at. That's the warp pipe we want to teleport to. But we also need to have another condition saying, well, currently warp pipe 1A and 2A both have the same warp pipe number. So the for loop may get confused by saying, okay, I got two warp pipes with the same number. So I've satisfied this, but there's two possible warp pipes I can go through. But we need to say, and warp pipe array, and then I for whatever element we're currently looking at in our array, does not equal past warp pipe object. Basically, we're saying we're going to ignore whichever warp pipe we're currently teleporting from. And we're going to set up my brackets. So we got a good warp pipe. Why don't we go ahead and use this for loop just to find the destination pipe we're trying to go to. So I'm going to make a new variable up here. I'm going to call it public game object dot destination pipe. All right. So we're going to say destination pipe equals warp pipe array bracket counter variable signifying which pipe in our array we're looking at currently in our for loop dot game object. All right, that I is a very powerful little variable inside of our for loop because it works really well with arrays. This I basically allows us to go through every single warp pipe in our array and test whether or not it's the warp pipe we want to warp to and if it's the warp pipe we're currently standing on. All right, so now we'll be able to update what destination pipe we want to go to. So I'm going to hit Control S and save. And you'll notice I now have a destination pipe game object. So now we can actually test this. And I want you guys to keep an eye on our inspector. And whenever I teleport on a warp pipe, you should see the destination pipe become populated. So right now we don't have a destination pipe populated. But if I get on top of warp pipe A and press C, then what destination pipe do you think will be populated over here in my array? Warp pipe 2A. So if we had our transport code typed, we'd end up on warp pipe 2A. So if I get up on 2A and press C, my new destination pipe is 1A behind me. So this line of code right here is really powerful. It's what allows us to find out exactly where we want to be teleported to or transported to. All right. So we can say now outside of our for loop, we've got our destination pipe. It runs through those all the pipes in our array real quick and finds the exact destination pipe we want. We can just go ahead and say player.transform.position. We're taking our player's current position, and now we're setting it equal to destination pipe.transform.position. Hit Control S, and so we made this outside of our for loop. So now, whenever we press play, we're instantly transported between our warp pipes. And it works for warp pipe B as well. So remember, the thing that makes it work between which warp pipe you want to warp back and forth between is this warp pipe number we've assigned to every warp pipe on our collision script that checks for the trigger of our collider whenever our player stands on top of our pipe. So that warp pipe number allows us to be able to say, okay, the B pipes are warp pipe number 2, the A pipes are warp pipe number 1, and we can go in between those two. But I promised that there would be screen transition effects, like a fade in and fade out. So why don't we go ahead and see how we can add that fade effect to our game. So we got our transportation worked out. Now let's add that cool fade in and fade out effect, so it's just not a jarring teleportation. All right, it's a little bit of finish on here. So the first thing we're going to have to do is create some UI elements. So I'm going to go and right click in my hierarchy, and I'm going to go to UI, and I'm going to create a canvas. And I'm going to just call this UI canvas. All right. Screen space overlay will be fine, but I like to change the scaler to scale with my screen size, so it automatically will scale everything depending on what size or aspect ratio your screen's currently in. 16:9 is what I usually work with. So I have my UI canvas rocking. Now I want to right click on my UI canvas, and I'm going to go to UI, and I want to give it an image. I want to call this fade image. Okay. And you can see in my game view right now, I have this white square sitting inside of my view. And if you scroll out big time, you can actually see the whole UI in your game scene. What I want to do is I want to make the square encompass the entire screen. So I want to go to my height and width over here in my inspector with my fade image selected. I'm going to set this to just a huge number, 3000 by 3000. And you'll see now my screen is totally white. But I want to make it black. I mean, we can fade in from white if you want. But I typically want to fade in from black. So I'm going to click this little color and just bring down the black color here. But there's an interesting slider here. The A for alpha channel is what we want to access to create this nice fade in and fade out effect. And that's what we're going to be using. This channel right here is what we're going to be using to create those fade in and fade outs. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this all the way black of a value of 255. We're just going to work with a big black screen for right now, but pretty soon we're going to be able to fade in and fade out from that. The next thing I need to do is go to my code and my game manager. We're pretty much done with warp pipe at this point, and I need to do a few things. I need to go all the way up to line 3 in my code, and I need to import my Unity engine .ui libraries because I need to use some UI functions to get this to work. So we're going to come down and make a new variable. It's going to be public. It's going to be of type graphic, and we're going to call this fade image. We're going to hit Control S. And now in my game manager, I have a fade image none graphic, and we're just going to take this fade image. We're going to plop it right into our fade image variable that we just made in our game manager. This is going to give us access to this fade image game object or fade image graphic. All right. So now that we can access our fade image, what are we going to do? Well, we need to have a way to fade in and fade out from black to white. What's the easiest way to do that? Well, I'm going to create a function here. It's going to be a void fade to black function. And it's going to take a Boolean that we're going to call fade. This function right here, we're going to be able to call in anywhere in our game manager code to trigger a fade to black. So we're going to say if fade equals true, meaning if I'm up here in my awake and I say fade to black function, I want to call you. And do I want to fade to black? No. I want to fade from black to clear to transparent. So we're saying fade to black will be false. We're passing in this false variable to our new Boolean called fade. So if fade equals true, then we want to fade to black. And then I'm going to come down here. This is wrong syntax, but I'm going to go ahead and give you a preview. But if fade equals false, then I want to fade from black to transparent. So the line of code we're going to put down here is we're going to call up our fade image, and we're going to call a function inside of our Unity Engine UI library that we just used up there called crossfade alpha. And it's going to be 1 for completely black. That's going to be our alpha value. 1 means it's completely black. And then how fast is it going to fade to black? Well, fade time, we don't have, what is fade time? Well, this is a public float we're going to make real quick. So I'm going to come up to the top of my code, public float, fade time. So now we can say, okay, I want my fade time to be this fast or this slow from my inspector. And then we're going to say false. This is some kind of weird time scale, ignore time scale value. We're not going to be really using it, so we're always just going to keep it false in this regard. So I'm going to copy this line of code. I'm going to come right underneath this else. The only thing I'm going to change is that first value to 0, meaning we want to go completely transparent with a value of 0 alpha. All right. So let me bring up my game manager again. I accidentally closed it out. All right. So we got a nice fade to black function right here. And I want to make sure this is an else if, because I have I have a conditional statement here. All right. So what do you think will happen now that when we awake, fade to black function, we're going to say it's false? Well, it's going to call this function down here. It's going to say that the past fade Boolean that we're saying right here is false. False is going to be transported down to this fade Boolean. And this else if statement is going to say, okay, fade equals false. So we're going to take our fade image and cross fade its alpha from whatever current value it is all the way down to 0, meaning the screen will be completely clear and free of any black color. So I'll hit Control S. I need to go to my game manager. I now have a fade time variable to set to. So I'm going to say 2. So now when we press play on our game, over 2 seconds, we get a nice fade in. Likewise, if I want a quick fade in, I can say 0.5, and we get a quicker fade in time. All right. When you fade in, that means it's no longer black. It goes from black to clear. Fade out means it goes from your clear view to your black. So just to get that terminology down. All right. So that helps us go from this black to a clear view of our scene, but it doesn't really do anything for our warp pipe yet. We just have a nice function that we can call that fades our screen in and out. So what we have to do now is we have to play with some coroutines real quickly. All right. So instead of calling this player transform position update, I'm going to comment that out for a second. I'm going to actually call a coroutine that we're going to make right now. So I'm going to say start coroutine. And why don't we say warp transition. And then we're going to close it with 2 parentheses and then close it with 1 more closed parentheses. So this is how we're going to call our coroutine, but we haven't made our coroutine yet. So let's do that outside of our public void warp function. So in between our 2 fade to black functions and warp functions. So let's say i.e. numerator. This is how you start a coroutine function. And then we're going to call it warp transition. We're going to close that parentheses and give it our brackets. So now we have a coroutine function declared. Now we need to actually make it do some things for us. So what we want to do is we want to be able to say, okay, whenever we crouch on our pipe, we want the screen to go from clear to black. So we want to fade to black over, let's say, 1 second. After it's faded to black, we want to transport our player to the next warp pipe, and then we want to fade from black to a clear view of our screen. And that's where coroutines really come in handy, because we can wait a few seconds in between doing things. So as soon as we call our coroutine, why don't we fade our screen? So I'm going to say fade to black, and we want that to be true. We want to fade a screen to black after we go through our warp pipe. And then we're going to do a yield return new, and then we're going to wait for seconds. And how long are we going to wait? Well, let's wait our fade time so we can make sure our screen fades to black in a timely amount, in a good amount of time. All right, we'll end that with a semicolon. And then after we've waited for seconds, so after we waited for our fade to black function to take our screen from clear to black, we're going to wait our fade time. Then we're going to call our function again. And this time we want it to be false because we want to go from black to clear. And then we're going to update our player's position. So I'm just going to copy and paste that line of code I had up there. And I think that should be it for our coroutine. I like to have 2 spaces in between my functions, so I can read it a little bit easier. All right, just cleaning up some of my spacing here. So, all that being done, there we go. So I get on top of my warp pipe. I'm currently in my warp pipe collider box. I press C. It starts that warp function and calls my coroutine. We're waiting for a fade time here, and we're transporting as soon as our fade to black is done. We're transporting our character while also fading in. Okay, so that's basically how we do that. It's a little bit of a rabbit hole because we're jumping from function to script a lot here. So I'm just going to walk us through it again real quick. If you got it, you don't need to keep watching. You got it down and you understand everything. But I'm just going to walk us through our logic before we end the video. All right. So the first thing we need to look at is how we've set up our warp pipe. All right. We have our warp pipe mesh underneath our warp pipe collider. And this collider is important because it is a trigger so we can tell when our player is on top of our warp pipe. And it also has our warp pipe script right here that we can assign our indication number of which warp pipe we're currently rocking. All right. I want to get this fade image and turn it off for right now so we can see what's going on in my scene a little bit easier. So after we jump on top of our warp pipe and we press the C key, all right, we're inside of our box collider, and then we press our C key, and then we're going to call our warp function in our game manager. So when we call our warp function, we're going to pass in which warp pipe number we're currently sitting on, and we're actually going to pass in the warp pipe object we're sitting on. All right, those 2 values get passed into this line of code right here. We get access to that warp pipe number that we're sitting on, and we get access to the actual object of the warp pipe that we're sitting on. And then we use this for loop to go through every single warp pipe in our game scene. All right, so if I hit play and pause, we have an array of all of our warp pipes. All right, and then this array uses a counter variable to basically stand in as which element we're currently looking at in our array. And we literally go through every single array in this warp pipe using this for loop until we find a warp pipe whose number matches the passed in warp pipe number and is not the warp pipe we're currently standing on. All right. And then we can get an update to what destination pipe we want. So if these two conditions are true, then we update our destination pipe to whatever warp pipe we're currently pointing at in our array using our for counter variable I right there. So after we find our destination pipe and we've gone through every single pipe in our array to find it, we're going to call this coroutine so we can get a nice fade to black over the amount of fade time. So this coroutine basically allows us to fade to black before we start to transport our character to the correct destination pipe, and then we fade in back into our scene like so. This void fade to black function just basically takes a true false variable. So when we call our fade to black function, do we want to fade to black? Yes, we do, so that's true. Do we want to fade out of black? Well, yes, so do we want to fade to black? No. Do we want to fade to black? Will be false. So we call this conditional statement then. And fade image.crossfade alpha, which is a function in our Unity Engine.ui library. And these two numbers right here say, do we want to go full black or do we want to go clear? So that's basically what's happening inside of our code. All right, great. So that does it for this video. Hopefully you learned a thing or two about using UIs and coroutines and crossfade alpha functions to create a nice little, warp system inside your scene that's not jarring. And we need to reactivate that fade image game object to get the fade to work again. So not only have we created a nice little fade in when we begin our game, but we've created some nice fade ins and fade outs when we go in between our warp pipes. All right, perfect. So thanks for watching the video, and hope you make some good games using these methods.